What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're going to be looking at this video from Help Me Believe, where he trash talks mythicism.
Gospels don't count as sources for Jesus because they're biased. This is so rich. I want to put it on a plaque up on my wall behind me. First, this is just as stupid as saying medical textbooks don't count because they're written by doctors. If that sounds stupid, that's what this objection sounds like to me. Well, doctors are experts in their field, of course they count. Exactly. Those who are closest to Jesus would be the best sources to look at if we wanted to know about him, especially if we would even just wanted to know that he existed.
So yeah, if you want to understand why he's wrong in his assessment of mythicism or the sources for Jesus, then please stay tuned.
So, is Jesus a myth, or was Jesus simply a myth? This is an idea that has gained popularity on YouTube and amongst lay audiences, not in scholarship. That's a good thing to point out, but anyway.
He wants to make it seem like, it's only popular on the internet. And really, it's not. It's gaining a lot of traction in scholarship. So far, we've got Richard Carrier that did his 2 books on this particular topic. And then we also have Raphael Lataster, who has done his own work on it as well. So it's gaining traction in scholarship. And specifically, Raphael Lataster's book was actually aimed at universities, meant to be a textbook. So to say that it's only popular online is pretty disingenuous. Now, I will say that in the past, the mythicism has not had a foothold in scholarship whatsoever, and there have been a lot of bad mythicist ideas out there. I agree with this. You can't judge mythicism solely on the fringe elements of mythicism. I would say the fringe elements would be people like archeological, as well as other people like that whole zeitgeist thing. That was just, oh man, that was embarrassing. But the point is that we have started to actually ground mythicist claims and the mythicist hypothesis in actual scholarship. So what he's presenting here is totally disingenuous.
Let's address the question, was Jesus simply a myth? Before we start looking at some positive evidence for the existence of Jesus, let's take a look at some of the arguments that you hear from these people that are known as Jesus mythicists. One of the most popular objections is that there's no archaeological evidence of Jesus. Ooh, he must not have existed. There's no coins with his face on it. There's no inscriptions, that sort of thing. Is this good evidence that he didn't exist? Is this supposed to lead us towards the proposition that he didn't exist?
No, I would say that's not. For one thing, Jesus wasn't a ruler like, Pius or Hadrian or Trajan. We don't expect to find coins or necessarily archaeological evidence. What we would expect is at least some kind of eyewitness testimony for Jesus. You trying to paint mythicists as requiring hard evidence such as archaeological evidence is a bit disingenuous. In order to establish somebody in history, we don't necessarily need hard evidence in order to establish them. To establish somebody as existing in history, we don't need hard evidence to do that. We could have eyewitness testimony or any other kind of testimony that would be able to attest for the person that we're trying to investigate. That's all. A point against you, I guess, so far, because this just screams dishonesty.
Of course not. First of all, who from the first century does have archaeological evidence? Not very many people, mostly just a handful of very famous politicians and people of that sort. You would have to have been a well-off aristocrat to even have some sort of archaeological evidence for yourself. And even if you did, there's a good chance that it wouldn't have lasted for 2,000 years. So this is just not a good objection at all. All it means is that's not how we're going to figure out if Jesus did actually exist.
So to claim that a specific person existed in history and did something noteworthy noteworthy enough, you would need actual evidence for it. To act like we only have like archaeological evidence for important people in the past, I think is rather disingenuous, because I mean, we obviously have archaeological evidence for, just everyday people existing back then. But if they did something noteworthy enough, we would definitely expect somebody to write it down or to write about it, or for that particular event to have some effect on history. And we just don't find that for Jesus, because keep in mind, Jesus wasn't Joe Blow Snow back in, Judea in the 30s. They want to make him out to be some like relatively unknown person, but that's not, for one, how the Gospels describe him, and two, that's not how Paul talks about Christianity, the Christian faith, and the Christian population. So it's rather disingenuous for you to sit there and act like, oh, Jesus was just some random guy. Of course, some random guy existed in history. It's not exactly that clear cut. And for Jesus to have done what he supposedly had done, you would expect a lot more evidence than there actually is.
So remember that Jesus was just a simple, poor, peasant, Jewish, itinerant preacher in the first century. Why would we even expect to find archaeological evidence of him? It's not expected, and nobody is surprised that there isn't any.
So, I mean, I would agree. I don't expect archaeological evidence for Jesus, although archaeological evidence would really solidly put, like, the nail in the coffin for mythicism. If we had any archaeological evidence whatsoever. Like, there's this claim that the tomb of Jesus has been found. There's been multiple tombs of Jesus to be found. There's been multiple holy sites where apparently Jesus, stood or had his feet washed and, I don't know, did some sexual thing with some girl's hair in his feet. I don't know what kind of fetishes they had back then. The point is that archaeological evidence would definitely disprove mythicism, but we don't find that. Not that that's an argument necessarily against his existence in general, but just that you don't have that evidence, and so that makes it less certain that he existed in history, because history is built off of probabilities. What most likely happened. He's painting archaeological evidence as like this argument that mythicists use to definitely say Jesus didn't exist in history, which is not at all the case. And then he's also misrepresenting how we determine somebody to exist in history.
A second common objection that you hear from Jesus mythicists is that we have no writings from Jesus himself. Again, this surprises absolutely nobody. In the first century, most people were illiterate. So whenever I died, there'll be a bunch of audio, video, and writings, if you keep up with the blog, that will attest to the fact that I actually existed. So the idea that Jesus, somebody who existed in the first century, doesn't have any writings surprises absolutely no historians, and no historians count this as evidence against his existence.
I would agree that Jesus not having written anything, about himself or to anybody or anything like that is not surprising, but is also not exactly the only evidence that we're looking for. I've actually never heard a mythicist use this particular argument. Maybe using it in comparison to like other historical figures like Pius or Hadrian or Trajan. All of those guys had stuff that they wrote themselves, and so they would have been educated, they would have been able to write, but that's not the only evidence that we have for those particular historical figures. Like, we have other evidence, not just archaeological evidence in the form of buildings or coins or mundane papyri that like rental agreements or marriages or priest ordinations and stuff like that. We not only have that, but we also have them affecting the culture around them, having other people that, took notice of them, these other people that could read and write, and they wrote about him. So really, all mythicists want, or expect rather, is that the people that could read and write would read and write about things that were happening. And if Jesus created this monumental movement that he made such a stink in that area of the world, you would expect people to write about him. I mean, just take Josephus. Flavius Josephus, he wrote about several failed messiahs. Why wouldn't he write about Jesus? I mean, I know that a lot of people think that he did write about Jesus. We're going to get to that here later, maybe. The fact is that he didn't write the Testimonium Flavianum, and the James passage is interpolated. And this is known in the scholarship. Why didn't Josephus mention him? Like, why didn't he naturally mention him in his writings? He mentioned other people. So this is what I'm saying. We only expect people that could read and write to actually read or write about Jesus at this point in time.
Another common one you'll hear is that there are no Greek or Romans in the first century who write about Jesus. If Jesus was this famous preacher or whatever, why don't we see any first century Romans or Greeks writing about him? Obvious question.
This is a very good question. Why didn't other people write about Jesus? The only near contemporary that we have is Paul. There's nobody else that writes around this time. And there would have been plenty of people around this time that would have wanted to write about a historical Jesus. It doesn't even have to be like contemporary. Just somebody citing a motherfucker that saw Jesus on earth would be awesome. But we don't actually find that in history. We don't find anybody referencing any earthly eyewitness to Jesus. So excuse me for having some doubts about whether or not he actually walked the earth when we don't even have anybody that saw the motherfucker.
Why on earth would they? Again, why would they write about a backwoods Jewish peasant? We have no reason to expect that they would. They certainly wouldn't have been followers of Jesus, so why would they write about him? There were plenty of itinerant preachers at the time, even more than one person claiming to be the Jewish Messiah. They simply did not care. Why would we expect to find it in their writings?
I like the double standard here, because what he's saying is that, Jesus was so uninspiring. Jesus was so unoriginal, and he was so easily written off that not even the people that recorded other messiahs at the time wanted to write about him. But yet at the same time, he was inspirational enough to create this entire movement around the idea that he is the Son of God. It's rather peculiar. People that wrote about other messiahs, I would expect them to write about yet just another messiah that failed to be the Jewish messiah, which there's different ideas about the messiah in Judaism. One version is that he's supposed to be a conqueror, and then another couple of versions is a lot similar to Jesus, where he's supposed to die for the sins of the people and then resurrect. So, I mean, there's a vast landscape of different ideas about messiahs. So basically what he's saying here is that he's asking us to believe that the people that were already writing about these failed messiahs wouldn't write about another failed messiah. How does that make sense?
But of course, this objection's actually false if you consider that Luke was most likely a Greek physician. Of course, the Jewish mythicists will probably not count that. Luke didn't actually write that gospel. We don't even know that Luke existed, blah, 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 blah. Well, you asked, and now you have been answered. You ask and you shall receive.
It's funny because the fact that Luke did not write Luke Acts is mainstream scholarship. It is not a mythicist position. This is just a general historiographical position. It's not a mythicist idea. I mean, Luke not writing Luke Acts was known well before the scholarly support for mythicism.
But more importantly, how many Greeks or Romans in the first century mentioned Pontius Pilate? Well, Luke does if you want to count him again, but I'm betting you don't want to count him. Other than that, zero. How many mention Flavius Josephus? Zero.
Oh, I am so glad that you asked, because this is in an upcoming update for my Crestus app. If you guys want to go and download, which I probably have a little thing right here, please do. My Crestus app has all of this juicy fucking information inside of it. If you really want to know who writes about Pontius Pilate, Philo of Alexandria wrote extensively on Pilate. Not only that, but we do have archaeological evidence for Pilate in the Pilate stone, which has Pilate's name and position carved in on it, and it was actually commissioned by Pilate himself. Josephus also mentions Pilate. So for you to claim that that we just have zero references to Pilate in history other than like Luke or anybody else that's in the Bible is rather disingenuous. We have so much more evidence for Pilate than Jesus. Also, we have direct writings from Josephus, so we don't necessarily need other authors to affirm his existence when we have writings by him, signed by him.
These last two are my favorite. I just love them. The Gospels don't count as sources for Jesus because they're biased. This is so rich. I want to like put it on a plaque up on my wall behind me.
Well, why don't you do it? And it's not because the Gospels are biased exactly. It's just because they're written so much later that they can't give us any kind of good information as to what Jesus actually did. Not to mention the fact that these things were written right about the time when any eyewitnesses would be dying. And then lastly, it doesn't actually cite, like none of the Gospels actually cite earthly references to Jesus. So those are the reasons why we don't consider the Gospels to be legitimate in establishing Jesus's historicity or anything that Jesus could have done. So don't act like it's just this one particular point that, oh, they're a biased source. Okay, yeah, true, they probably are. But even in a biased source, we can get some basic information, like whether or not somebody existed. That would go a long way to proving that Jesus definitely existed in history. The point is that it's not the bias that precludes them from being evidence for Jesus. It's the time in which they were written, the sources that they cite and don't cite, and then there's the fact that you really only have one gospel that's independent, and that would be Mark, even though he technically uses Paul. So, of the gospels, you've really only got the one gospel.
First, this is just as stupid as saying medical textbooks don't count because they're written by doctors. If that sounds stupid, that's what this objection sounds like to me.
Well, luckily, I don't really give a shit what you think, so I don't care if you feel like, you know, the whole medical textbook and Bible analogy is legitimate. The fact of the matter is that it's not the bias that precludes it. It's the fact that they were written so late to the point where there would be no eyewitnesses, and they don't cite eyewitnesses.
Well, doctors are experts in their field, of course they count. Exactly. Those who were closest to Jesus would be the best sources to look at if we wanted to know about him, especially if we would even just wanted to know that he existed.
I agree. Having some kind of written source from people that personally knew Jesus would be awesome. And in fact, I would give up my mythicism right now if you could solidly establish that any disciple actually wrote anything in history. No, you can't, because those don't fucking exist. Oh, okay. Well, I'll just, put the mythicism right in my back pocket.
Secondly, this claim of bias insinuates that they had some motive to lie. That's what you're really getting at, that they were lying about this. They just made the story up. People don't just make stuff up or lie for no reason. So I will wait the rest of my life to hear a good response to why would they lie. It's not going to happen.
Did you really just claim that just nobody lied in history? Well, I guess technically you said nobody would lie for no reason, like they would have a reason behind it. But I find that incredibly odd that you would say, oh, these guys wouldn't lie. I mean, yeah, it's definitely possible that they could have lied. But I also think that it's not just as simple as like them wanting to lie. I mean, you can believe something is a fact. You can believe something actually happened. You can be convinced by something to have actually happened, but yet it not actually happened. So it's not a lie inherently. It's just bad information. But you painting it as the bias inherently meaning that they were trying to lie for their faith, or they were trying to lie to somehow deceive people into believing in Jesus, is just disingenuous. They can be biased just simply because they believed Jesus actually existed or actually did these things. That's how they can be biased and not lie. But you're painting a false dichotomy here in order to make your argument that they just simply wouldn't lie. That's just so stupid.
Most importantly, the atheist making this objection, or not necessarily an atheist, but the mythicist making this objection, is also biased. You know why? Because all people are biased. And if we should dismiss people who are biased, then we shouldn't listen to anyone, including ourselves. And so this objection is actually self-defeating, unless you are so arrogant as to claim to be the bastion of objectivity and claim that you have no biases. If that's you, you're excused from the dialogue.
Oh, well, I guess God is excused from the dialogue then, isn't he? You got so many Christians out there that are wanting to talk for God, and they claim to be the bastions of objectivity. It's just so fucking hilarious, this coming from a Christian. I mean, you guys claim to follow the one bastion of objectivity. But in any case, again, the bias is not the problem. You're right. We all have biases. But the point is that you're supposed to try to remove any bias that you could possibly have, not show favoritism for one kind of evidence over the other. If you have evidence that breaks your hypothesis, it would be a show of your bias to disregard it just because it's not what you want the evidence to be.
But of course, biased people can make true claims. I'm biased. I want Christianity to be true. I'm fine saying that. You know why? Because it doesn't mean anything. It wouldn't mean anything if I was the most biased person in the world. I was raised a Christian and I believe it because my parents told me it was true. And now I'm simply going out to find evidence to confirm what I already believe. That wouldn't matter at all. You would still have to weigh the evidence on the basis of reality, of is it good reasoning? Is it good evidence? Does it actually corroborate the claim? The bias thing just means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. And when you hear it, you can simply dismiss it. It doesn't matter.
What the fuck are you talking about? Did you literally just say that you could be the most biased person on earth, but yet you can still be objective when looking at the evidence? Like, I feel like this is an oxymoron. You're the most objective, biased person ever. But in all seriousness here, you're the most biased Christian ever. Do you not think that bias would affect how you viewed the evidence? Like, you have people out there with clear Christian biases that are looking at the evidence for, say, evolution. And they come away saying, nope, that doesn't prove evolution, when in fact it actually does. So your entire rant here about biases and how it just doesn't matter if you're biased or not, it does matter, because when you go to look at the evidence, you have to make sure that your bias isn't getting in the way. I have to check myself constantly on that in this particular subject, the mythicism subject. All the time I have to check my bias, because if there's some evidence that throws a wrench in my gears as far as mythicism goes, I have to look at it and try to be as objective as possible. The problem here, though, is that the authorities in this matter have a Christian bias. If you want to look at David Fitzgerald's Jesus Mything in Action, the first book in that series has a study where they show that all of the teaching institutions that employ the historians that most people like claim that they want to hear from, which it's kind of funny that they use the consensus of the wider scholarly community for certain things, but for other things they only want this hyper specific like consensus among New Testament teaching scholars is what they want. But what you find is that all of those people have to work at these Christian institutions that require you to be a Christian. This bias is very important, because this bias causes you to look at evidence for like the resurrection and claim that a Jew died on a stick in the 1st century and then was resurrected magically, supernaturally by God to absolve the sins of everybody. Fuck me for pumping on the goddamn brakes on this shit show.
Another one that I hear often is that the Gospels are not independent of each other. Matthew and Luke are dependent on Mark, and probably John is too. This amounts to nothing more than somebody who heard that Matthew and Luke borrow a lot, about 90% of Mark's Gospel is included in theirs, and then they just ran with that. They didn't read the scholarly opinion on this or anything like that. They have no idea what they're talking about. They just heard that and they're like, ooh, I can use this against the Christians. This will be a good one. They can't come back from this one. Well, it's really not hard. About 20% of Matthew's gospel is unique. About 35% of Luke's gospel is unique. Matthew and Luke share a common separate source apart from Mark, and there's little to no evidence that John's gospel is dependent on the other three at all.
Okay, so John's gospel is definitely using Mark's gospel in order to create his narrative, but we're going to get to that here in a second. It's actually mainstream scholarship, and I'm not going to say consensus because I think that it's kind of hard to determine what the actual consensus is in these areas. The mainstream scholarship, the overwhelming mainstream scholarship shows that Mark is the independent gospel that informed Matthew, Luke, and John. And I actually probably have a link down below to this one guy, Jimmy Akin, which if you guys don't know, he regularly goes on the Catholic Answers live show. He analyzed it himself, being a Catholic, and came away saying, yeah, John used Mark in order to craft his narrative in whatever way that was. So you not only have like Christians that are admitting that John used Mark, but you have mainstream scholarship that indicates that John used Mark and that Mark is the only independent gospel while the other ones have used Mark. The Q source is indistinguishable from Mark. Okay, they say that the Q source existed prior to Mark, and then Mark used Q, and then Matthew and Luke also used Q. Mark Goodacre actually has a really good argument against the Q source. So that physically doesn't exist, but I don't even think that it hypothetically exists. So you really just have Mark.
And so for you math whizzes out there, that's 5 separate independent and early sources for the existence of Jesus.
No. You see what he's done here? He's taken one source in history, Mark, and he's turned it into 5 different sources. This is not how historiography works. If you have one guy that writes an account of one thing, and then you have all of his buddies copy off of him, and they have the same shit that the one guy does, do you have one source or 5? You definitely don't have 5 sources. That's for fucking sure. You just have the one guy that wrote something down.
And by the way, I should really say it's at least 5 independent sources, because the gospel writers would have in all likelihood have used multiple sources as they created their gospels. When we say there's 5 sources, we mean at least 5 sources or traditions. There would have been multiple independent people along the way, so there's no telling how many actual independent sources we have here, but we have at least 5. And if that's not good enough for you, then I don't know what to tell you. I guess you're excused from the dialogue because you're not willing to do honest historical investigation, because 5 independent early sources is good enough to establish a consensus, which is what we have in scholarship. There is a scholarship in a scholarly consensus. This did Jesus exist is not a question that actual scholars ask. What they're asking nowadays is, what can we know about Jesus? The question of Jesus' existence was solved in modern scholarship 30 years ago. So what you have is the lay audience is about 30 years behind the scholarship, which is typical with lay audience versus scholarship. But I mean, just get with the times. He existed. There's absolutely no question.
You know, I don't think that he realized that he did this, but he's talking about how the Gospels use these other sources in order to inform their gospel about what Jesus said and did, right? But yet, he even said that it's ridiculous to think that Luke didn't write Luke. And these Gospels are supposed to be eyewitness accounts. If Luke was an eyewitness, why did he have to use other sources to inform himself about it? Like, if Luke was writing from his own perspective about the events of Jesus' life, why was he having to use these other sources? You would think that he would even cite these sources if he used them, right? If he went back and he, investigated this stuff, you would think that he would cite them in his gospel or in Acts, but he doesn't. He doesn't do any of that. So it's kind of weird. This entire video kind of has like a double standard feel, because you have a Christian saying that biases don't matter, and then he's interpreting the information with a Christian lens and coming away saying, oh yeah, we've got 5 sources, when that's not even how historiography is done. Right here, he's claiming that if you can't do honest historiography, that's rich coming from you, Mr. Turning one source into fucking 5.
And the 5 independent sources that we find in the Gospels should be good enough to convince any reasonable person, but even if it's not, I'm going to get to a few more, but first, some outside the Gospels, but first, I want to point out that all of the objections, sparing the last 2, are nothing but arguments from silence. They're arguments based on what we don't see, what you don't find, what somebody did not say. That is a fallacious argument. That is a logical fallacy known as an argument from silence. It's not a good way to argue. In fact, again, it's a fallacious way to argue. It's a logical fallacy. It does not count for anything. Arguments from silence mean nothing.
So the argument from silence is kind of nuanced here. Just because somebody doesn't mention something in the past doesn't mean that that something didn't happen, right? Just because one author doesn't write about every single thing that happened, that doesn't mean that these other things didn't happen. But I say that it's nuanced because if there's sufficient reason for an author to write about something and he doesn't, that speaks volumes. At that point, it's no longer fallacious, the argument from silence. For instance, if I said that Godzilla sank the Titanic, nobody mentions that in history. Nobody says it. But by using this guy's standards here, he would say, oh, well, that's just fallacious reasoning. You could just dismiss the idea that an iceberg sank it when obviously Godzilla sank that motherfucking ship, right? Just because people didn't talk about it at the time doesn't mean that it didn't happen. See, when all the other indications and all of the other accounts seem to be silent on the fact that Godzilla sank the Titanic, speaks volumes to the idea that Godzilla sank the Titanic. It's the same case with Jesus here. The fact of the matter is that if Jesus was influential enough to inspire an entire movement of people, let alone do the things that are said to have been done in the Gospels, you would expect people to write about it. There were people that were recording other messiahs at the time. Why should they write about one messiah but not another messiah? And it's not just that, oh, this was, they were writing about a messiah in a different area. These were messiahs, Jewish messiahs that were in the same area, and they were perceived to have failed as well. So why wouldn't, Josephus actually write about Jesus as a failed messiah? Philo of Alexandria, he wrote fuck tons about Pilate. Why didn't he write about this itinerant preacher that made such a scuffle that made Pilate such a pansy ass in the Gospels? Here's another example. Nobody anywhere records a supernatural eclipse or an earthquake that happened in 30 or 33, whichever particular gospel you want to read. Using this guy's logic right here, you would have to just dismiss the idea that they didn't happen because nobody anywhere writes about it. There's no physical evidence of it happening. And the way that the moon operates, in orbit around the earth wouldn't allow for an eclipse at that particular time. Just because all of that silence is an argument from silence, you should just throw away the idea that they didn't happen. If there's a major claim for something in history, but there's no evidence that it happened, that has to say something about whether or not that thing happened. He's about to go into these extra biblical sources. We've been through them before. If you're really interested in seeing me respond to them, let me know in the comments and I'll consider making a follow-up video. It's already gone a long time already. This is probably a pretty long video for a Wednesday. But if you want to see that, then just let me know in the comments and I would gladly go through his evidence for Jesus. So far, it's all very contradictory and it's very confusing to even listen to, so it can only get worse from here. But like I said, let me know down in the comments. If you will, while you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like historical videos like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.